This section focuses on basic measures defined by levels and standards of consumption, including consumption expenditure, gross national product, gross domestic product, and purchasing power parity. The well-being of individuals together with exploitation of citizens living in countries where majority of the textiles and apparel supply chain activities are uh, done is primary global issue, and that's why the measures of well-being is an important issue to discuss. Levels and standards of consumption and living are commonly used measures of well-being. To be effective, however, things like inflation must be accounted for because inflation reduces purchasing power and distorts comparisons of different places and points in time. Sometimes exchange rates also have been considered as as measures of well-being and buying power, consumers' buying power. Um, and Inflation can be described or defined as an increase in prices creating a decrease in the purchasing power of a monetary unit like the dollar. Stancliffe Davis, in 1945, laid out a system of language for describing well-being. There were four different elements: consumption, living, level, and standard. Consumption includes any commodities, their uses, and services which are consumed by an individual. Living includes consumption and other dimensions of life like income, comfort, job security, safety. Level implies what is actually experienced. So it could be what is the level of comfort which an individual experiences. Standard is anything which is desired and sought. So you may experience a moderate level of job security at this point, but you aspire for having a very secure job in the future. So that would be the difference between level and standard. Level of consumption or buying power include the overall amount of food, fuel, and other non-durable goods which are consumed, the use of houses, automobiles, clothing, and other durable and semi-durable goods which are consumed, and the services of people used by an individual or group in a given period of time. So this is about the level of consumption. As we saw in our previous slide, we defined what level meant and what is standard. Level is something which you're actually currently experiencing. Um, Versus standard of living, which is defined as the level of consumption urgently desired or strived for. It is also dependent on working conditions, freedom of movement and association, safety and security, political and environmental atmosphere. So think about standard of living and um, level of consumption in developed, developing, and newly developing countries. And you can make those comparisons as you look at different measures along the way, especially GDP per capita or GNP. Those would be some of the measures which you can look at to understand the standard of living and consumption. It is rather common for standard of living to exceed level of living because even at high levels of consumption, the perception that more is better is always there. Think about you have a car, you are maybe a student, and you have a car, and at that point in time, as a student, you're just looking as a car as a necessity to help you move from point A to point B. As you progress in your professional lives, and we'll come to the income part of it a little later in this chapter, you will see that you strive or you aspire for a better model of car, and it could be for various reasons. It could be related to your job, or it could just be because you have high income and you want to, you always dreamt of a car. So you always feel that more is better. Standards of living commonly include desire for increased quantities of textiles and apparel products, and constant pressure is to increase levels of consumption and living to achieve an ever increasing standard of life. From an economic perspective, these products are what are sometimes called normal goods, especially for clothing purposes, clothing related or soft goods, and demand for them tends to be inelastic. And inelastic demand would basically mean that when income increases, expenditures for soft goods increase. When income decreases, expenditures decrease. But the increase and decrease are proportionally less than the change in income. And we will go in detail about income elasticities and what it does for goods in the next part. As we think about definitions of income and how income fits, if you may, within the whole measuring well-being or consumption, apparel industries employees must receive fair pay for their time and work. And generally, we assume that people are better off when income is higher. Evaluation of well-being of citizens or of cities, states, and countries are often gauged by levels of income and consumption expenditures. So if your GDP per capita is really low, then on an average, you may think that a person may not be able to spend as much on things of luxury or things they aspire for very easily. So there are different types of incomes based on how you would get them and what you do with them. Minimum wage, living wage, total income, disposable income, consumption expenditure, and discretionary income. You also can find the definitions of each of these incomes on page number 50 to 51, that is your global lexicon. We'll go into some of this now. Minimum wage is the lowest wage permitted by law or by special agreement, such as one with the labor union. Now, I want you to think back to our discussion in chapter 1 about um, how our countries categorize based on their economic development. So developed countries, minimum wages are something which are permitted by law. They're also regulated by law. However, in developing and newly developing countries, minimum wage is not as enforceable. They're not pushed for a minimum wage. And again, coming back to the perspective of how it relates to the textile and apparel industry, if developing and newly developing countries set a minimum wage, it would decrease their competition in the global apparel industry. And hence, governments do not push for minimum wages. Living wage, on the other hand, is a wage that is high enough to maintain a normal standard of living. And when we talk about a normal standard of living, we are looking at food, water, shelter, clothing, insurance, health benefits. So this is the wage needs to cover all of these expenses. Most of the times, the living wage does not equal to minimum wage, especially in developing and newly developing countries. It could be the case in most of the developed countries. Coming to total income is the gross income or personal income, what you make, what you're supposed to make as a whole. Disposable income is the take-home pay, which is basically um, income tax and other taxes are deducted from your total income to get disposable income. And once you have disposable income, you subtract savings and investment to get to the consumption expenditure. Consumption expenditure is the money used to support the level of consumption during a specific period. And your consumption level can change depending on how your income changes, as we have seen before. Discretionary income is the amount available after all obligations have been covered with disposable income. Just a note, when disposable income exceeds the level of savings, investment, and previously committed and other necessary consumption expenditures, discretionary income is available. Discretionary, and why are all these income or wages relevant to our industry is primarily because discretionary income is often associated with fashionable clothing purchases. As fashionable clothing purchases may be regarded as desirable according to standards, but not necessary according to levels of consumption. Again, reiterating, levels is what you're currently experiencing. Standards are something which you aspire for. And these are again very relevant as we talk about countries and their income, especially in terms of their economic development. Most of the population in newly developing countries may be below the poverty line. That is, they're trying to meet their minimum needs with whatever monies they have. Poverty can be defined as lack of enough income or resources or both to satisfy person's minimum needs. Poverty line is the point at which income or resources are inadequate to maintain life and health at a subsistence level. However, minimum needs for subsistence are not the same everywhere. So a poverty line in the US may look very different than poverty line in India. Minimum needs, on the other hand, are defined by standards and levels of consumption and living and could vary according to place and time. Think about internet in the developed countries and the variety of electronic devices are used regularly by majority of the people. As you will see in chapters 9 through 12, where we discuss about specific countries and regions in the world, you will see that there is also a column where you talk about the internet availability for different countries, and you can see how much difference it is in newly developing, developing, and developed countries. Consumer obsolescence and expended and purchasing power, as we discussed before. When adequate resources are available for replacement, fashion goods are discarded because of lack of interest. Just something to kind of related to this topic. In the US, 11 million tons of textiles are discarded every year, and this was the figure in 2018 by United States Environmental Protection Agency. One of the reasons of discarding at such high rates is just because the fashion is obsolete and there is no use for these garments from perspective of fashion or the need to include the clothing anymore in their in individuals inventory. So this practice in excess of retail inventories is feeding the second-hand clothing market, which is a discussion in itself, as second-hand export clothing markets are um, overly populated with clothing which is sent from developed countries. It is also harming their own clothing manufacturing industry in their countries.